in England. Ed Wasserman has been a member of the Department of Psychology at the University of Iowa since 1972, where he is the Stuit Professor of Experimental Psychology. His research has focused on cognition and behavior in humans and other animals, including pigeons, chickens, crows, rats, dogs, baboons, and bonobos. It's been supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and has enlisted an international contingent of students and collaborators from Canada, Chile, China, England, France, India, Japan, Malaysia, Russia, and Spain. Ed Wasserman was just selected by the American Psychological Association as the 2011 winner of the D.O. Hebb Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. The Hebb Award honors a psychologist who has made distinguished theoretical or empirical contributions to basic research in behavioral neuroscience and/or comparative psychology. Here to present Artificial and Natural Selection Made by Man and Nature, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ed Wasserman to Darwin Week 2011.
Well, it's great to be back again this year and to expand considerably on the presentation that I made last year. No, there'll be no magic. And I won't even try to speak in an English accent. Our prior speakers did, and I haven't. I can speak like Ren, but you know, it's just too crazy. No. I'll pass. It is a serious subject today, but I hope to have some anecdotes and applications of what I have to share with you. It is about Darwin, and it is about biology. But it also is about critical thinking and challenging ideas, indeed some of Darwin's. So when speaking about artificial selection, we have to make note of its importance to Darwin's own thought. Darwin drew a key insight for his theory of evolution by natural selection from his careful study of plant and animal breeding practices. From varied populations of plants and animals, it's now commonplace for humans to choose only some to breed. Over time, those that are chosen may dramatically change and evolve into so-called breeds that serve humans' needs and fancies. This is called artificial selection. Here are some products of artificial selection. The fan-tailed pigeon, you can't even see the dang bird's eye. There it is, right there. I wondered for a while. The English bulldog, the Siamese cat, the Holstein cow, and a number of other famous animals have been produced by human intervention. Because, according to Darwin's thinking, humans can greatly alter the form and behavior of plants and animals. Darwin believed that nature might achieve even more dramatic results over longer periods of time. Therefore, natural selection may parallel artificial selection. This was really key to Darwin's thinking. Well, how appropriate is the parallel? And is artificial selection artificial? So, my initial answers to these questions are, as to the appropriateness of the parallel between artificial selection and natural selection, yes, the parallel is quite appropriate, but I hope to surprise you for how. And is artificial selection artificial? The answer here seems to be absolutely not. It's completely natural. So, to Darwin's origin of natural selection, we have to ask, what are the origins of natural selection? How did Darwin come upon this idea? He said, all my notions about how species change are derived from long-term continued study of the works of agriculturalists and horticulturalists. I believe I see my way pretty clearly on the means used by nature to change her species and adapt them to the wondrous and exquisitely beautiful contingencies to which every living being is exposed. So Darwin's final reasoning on natural selection went like this. I came to the conclusion that selection was the principle of change from the study of domesticated productions. But here's a problem. Doesn't selection imply a selector? an intelligent agent with a design in mind. This is what we typically mean when we talk about selection. Well, evolutionists from Darwin to Dawkins have emphatically answered no. There is design without a designer. And there is selection without foresight. So what about this mindless selection? Let's ask a bit more about what Darwin had to say on this score. Now this is a key quotation from Darwin. It comes from his autobiography. It isn't cited often enough. The old argument of design in nature, he said, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. He discovered it. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being like the hinge of a door by man. There seems no more design in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. And I think this is Darwin at his best. So, natural selection is mindless. It lacks a plan and an intelligent designer. This we're all familiar with. Well, Dawkins is our contemporary exponent of mindless selection. What does he have to say on this score? He says, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Point of view, emphatic, straightforward, and so far so good. So to recapitulate, natural selection is an entirely natural means of changing the form and behavior of species via these classic three interrelated processes of variation, selection, and retention. Natural selection acts blindly, mechanically, and purposely via these three processes. Variation simply states that there are inheritable genetic differences among individuals. That with selection, there's differential reproduction of some of those individuals. And retention, there's differential representation of the fittest genetic variants in the gene pool. This is our contemporary understanding of the process of natural selection, embellished, of course, by molecular genetics alike. But what about artificial selection? This is where we came in. This is how Darwin got the idea for natural selection. What about artificial selection? Doesn't artificial selection require intelligent human agency? Isn't that how we talk about it? Well, it seems as though it does. Don't we design and execute our plans for new and improved plants and animals with clear purpose and foresight? Well, that certainly seems to be the case too, at least now. But, big but, how might artificial selection have arisen? What are its origins? Now, why would we ask about the origins of artificial selection? Indeed, few have. Well, we should care about the origins of artificial selection for the same reason we care about the origins of natural selection, because we want to know how they came about. If you look only at the final product, this tells you nothing in the scientific way about how it came to be. And looking only at the end product takes you to the place where a biblical interpretation is every bit as good as a scientific one, because there's no account for process. So what more might we say about the origin of artificial selection? Well, Dawkins had a little bit more to say. He said, our world is dominated by feats of engineering and works of art. We are accustomed to the idea that complex elegance is an indicator of premeditated, crafted design. This is probably the most powerful reason for the belief in some kind of intelligent design involving foresight and purpose. Well, artificial selection, back to artificial selection, it's a clear feat of biological engineering. It seems to exhibit intelligent design involving purpose and foresight. People, right, selectively breed animals to produce the variance that we get, for instance. But one theorist suggested that this might be a deception. That, in fact, artificial selection might not always be a conscious and deliberate process at all. So let's consider these perhaps unorthodox observations. And now we go to another individual, some quotations. I'm sorry, it's that kind of talk. This person said this: "At the present time, eminent breeders try by methodical selection to make a new strain or subbreed superior to anything that existed to that point. But a kind of selection which may be called unconscious may be more important. More important. What's unconscious selection, and how might it work?" So, if there exist savages so barbarous as never to think of the inherited character of the offspring of their domesticated animals, yet any one animal particularly useful to them would be carefully preserved. Such choice animals would leave more offspring than inferior ones. In this case, there would be a kind of unconscious selection going on. So you simply breed the animals that are the hardiest, the most fecund, that have the most offspring. You just breed those. You just do. The others may be more timid and run away. That's another factor that might come into play. But there's no foresight or purpose or plan behind it. This author, the one I'm talking about, knew about selective breeding and the fan-tailed pigeon. We come back to pigeons always. Know anything about me, you'll know why. The pigeon, the fan-tailed, is a very odd bird. You might ask, was it created with a clear goal in mind? Absolutely not, according to this author. Quote, "To use such an expression as trying to make a fantail is, I have no doubt, in most cases, utterly incorrect. The man who first selected a pigeon with a slightly larger tail never dreamed what the descendants of that pigeon would become through long-continued, partly unconscious, partly methodical selection." This is the seed for a theory of artificial selection, perhaps one you're not familiar with. Humans' earliest breeding practices probably did not involve foresight or design. This breeding may have been entirely random, and it might have produced variants which were more advantageous to human breeders. Simply selectively breeding those more effective animals or plants might have brought forth better variants and better breeding techniques, learning how, in fact, to choose particular animals to breed with one another. This would in turn produce more effective offspring, more effective breeding techniques. This is a kind of a co-evolutionary process, right? Where the breeders' behaviors are changing in response to the animals they're producing, okay? Such a progressive evolutionary process looks a lot like natural selection. And as was true for natural selection, telling the historical story here is extremely difficult and fraught with interpretive hazards. Why? Well, we just had a talk with looking at human skeletal remains or pre-human skeletal remains. If that doesn't give you clues, this will. Here's more from this author. We know nothing about, for instance, the origin of our domestic breeds. A breed, like a dialect of a language, can hardly be said to have had a definite origin. A man preserves and breeds from an individual with some slight deviation of structure, or takes more care than usual in matching his best animals, and thus slowly improves them. But the chance will be infinitely small of any record having been preserved of such slow, varying, and insensible changes. This is a painfully slow process, one not written down. There's no codification. There's no historical record for it. And yet, perhaps it really did happen, like the evolution of species, like natural selection. So artificial selection may have originated as a blind, unconscious, automatic process. Truly, trial and error learning by the breeders. Further, the products of artificial selection are very real organisms. So too are the breeders. Thus, it seems odd to claim that artificial selection is artificial. Real organisms changing other real organisms. Its naturalness can also be seen in relation to a third kind of biological selection. Here comes a surprise for you. This, sexual selection. What does this have to do with the story? Well, in sexual selection, physical or behavioral traits evolve when members of one sex, via choice or competition, affect the reproductive success of other members of the same species. Sexual selection is not to entail either foresight or design, right? Female elk don't plan to mate other elk males with larger horns. They just simply fancy those with larger horns. And these animals would then, with this trait, be more likely to procreate and thereby create other animals with larger horns. So here are two examples of selective breeding. On the left we have the product of human intervention. On the right we have the product of grouse intervention. So the sage grouse here has been, we believe the males have been shaped by females in terms of their physiognomy, their anatomy, and their behavior, right? In a way perhaps equally unconscious and undesigned as the fan-tailed pigeon. Well, by now you might have guessed that this person we're talking about was none other than Charles Darwin, the man who pointed us to natural selection, artificial selection, and sexual selection. In each case, Darwin believed that nature acts without design and via fixed laws. But the story might not be that simple. Why? Well, Darwin, you'll recall, did claim that humans design hinges, and they methodically breed plants and animals. Dawkins did claim that real watchmakers have foresight. They design their cogs and springs and plan their interconnections with a future purpose in their mind's eye, he said. Yet in these cases and countless others, we know next to nothing about the origins of these devices or the behaviors that are at issue. In other words, we're looking at final products, again, and having to now more seriously contemplate their origins. So what about hinges and watches? How did they come about? Does anyone know who invented the hinge, who invented the watch, how they came to be? Well, last year I shared with you a proposal that sounds radical, but I think is inherently Darwinian, that many innovative human behaviors and devices have in fact evolved or emerged through a trial and error process, one completely devoid of consciousness, foresight, or design. We published this article shortly afterward in the American Scientist. Anyone who wants to take a look, I'll be happy to give you the link or to send you a PDF. We entitled it Designing Minds. There's a double entendre there. And in this paper and in further work that I've done, I've been trying to find salient examples which support the notion that indeed much of what we do and what we've built is the product not of foresightful design and planning, but accident and the application of a principle that we call the law of effect, simple trial and error learning, where successful variants are retained and unsuccessful variants are dropped off in much the Darwinian way as with individual organisms. I could give you endless examples. Today I thought I'd just hit you up with 4 of them. 2 of them you're familiar with from last time, 2 others are new. The monkey crouch, the Fosbury flop, post-it notes, and the footprints at Grauman's Chinese theater. You want relevance? Here it is. Well, everybody wants relevance. This is what I can do. This is all that I can do. So, the monkey crouch. What the hey is monkey crouch? This is the monkey crouch. The jocks are leaned over, hunched over the horses in a particular pattern. Virtually all jocks ride this way now, but in the 1890s, no jocks ran that way. No one rode horses that way. This is how horses were raced. They were raced with this upright posture. Now you're probably thinking that some bright guy got down and took out his protractor and did some differential equations and figured out what it was that was going to create the monkey crouch. Of course you don't believe that, do you? But you'll believe a lot of other cases where design is supposed to be intentional. In fact, it was purely accidental that the monkey crouch came to be. There are a whole host of stories, one of which is traceable to an Englishman named Harding Cox, who was often saddled with really poor horses to ride, and in the course of doing his hunting, he discovered that when he rode upright, he felt a lot more wind resistance, a lot of wind resistance. And as he hunched over and leaned forward, it seemed that that wind resistance went down, and as he used that practice in his rides, when he was in fact racing horses, he was starting to win on horses that were back markers that had never won races before. Not only did he notice this, but so did his competitors. And in the span of 10 years, the style of riding at one of the famous derbies in England completely changed from this to this. We know that story, okay? Oh, by the way, it has nothing to do with wind resistance. That is another interesting part of the story. It has nothing to do with wind, or it has very little to do. The biomechanics of this has recently been studied, and it has to do with freeing the horse's hindquarters. When the jock leads over this way, it's a natural shock absorber. And so instead of the energy being dissipated one way, the jock, his head is straight, right? It doesn't go up and down. That means the horse is pushing off harder, not wasting energy, and the horse runs faster. Cool. Here's another example. Sports are fun. I always enjoy sports. At one point in time, this is how people went over the high bar, right? High jumping was done like this. Now everybody goes over like that. This somebody is Dick Fosbury. This is 1968 Olympics. He won the gold medal. He was a crappy high jumper. He was terrible because he kept trying to go over the bar with the customary techniques. He was ungainly. He was really tall, slender, and frankly, uncoordinated. And that created, by accident, his going over the bar backward. It wasn't planned. It wasn't designed. It wasn't foresightful. It was an accident. But he worked at it after going over backward, and he achieved heights that nobody had achieved before. The most remarkable thing is it was the gold medal in the Olympics. He was the only human being to go over the bar that way. Okay? That's a remarkable innovation. We know from his own account how it happened. That's what we usually don't know. Right? What we're missing in all of these cases is the real narrative. We're only faced with final products, and then we believe that it's done on drawing boards, like Richard Dawkins says. Here's another one. Post-it notes. Anyone know the story of Post-it notes? Brilliant idea. Brilliant. Let's get paper with glue on it that doesn't stick where it beams. Let's invent a glue that's bad. Okay? In fact, the glue was a failure. At 3M, the people who were making glue, this is their business, to make things stick, right? It was lousy. It didn't stick. Years went by with this stuff. They tried to figure out what to do with it. Somebody decided they put it on they put a little pad of it together, and they used it to mark the hymns in their book, church. And then they could peel it off, and it didn't tear the book up. This was an interesting observation. Well, overnight, you would expect then billions of these things to be sold. No. They test marketed it. Nobody would use it. They gave it away. Nobody used it. It took several runs for them finally to catch on. And now you got Post-its all over the freaking place. You got things in your books, you're right, I mean, they're everywhere. But it was a complete accident. And its actual functional use wasn't at all anticipated. It was bad glue. But now it's $1 billion product for 3M. And they tell the story on their website. a last one. Now, I suspect many of you haven't been to Hollywood. Just a wild guess, okay? But if you have, who's been to Hollywood? Have you seen the hand and footprints at the front of Grauman's Chinese? Okay. Brilliant idea. Get millions of people to mill around the front of the theater, seeing the handprints and footprints of movie stars. They'll flock there. You'll make millions. Great plan, right? How did it happen? By an accident. Either Norma Talmadge or Sid Grauman, you pick your story, stepped off, put footprints on when they were laying the concrete work out front of the theater after it had been built. And Grauman said, wait a minute, let's bring people back. So this is Douglas Fairbanks and his wife, Mary Pickford's handprints and footprints. They put them there. It was a kind of an amusement. This is the actual photograph when they were staging it, but it had been done earlier on. And the actual first person, I believe, is Norma Talmadge, not either of these two stars. But it's a case in point. What a brilliant idea to bring people to the theater, right? Wrong. That isn't how it happened at all. All right? But it's so easy to be seduced into believing, based on final products and not knowing the story. You know the story, this is what we're trying to figure out. And it isn't easy. Darwin said why it was so hard. Behavior doesn't fossilize. All the steps aren't there. There's no records being written as to how people bred animals. They didn't write when they were first breeding animals, right? They may not even have even spoken when they were breeding animals. So the narrative there is going to be tough. So, some concluding comments. I introduced Darwin's proposal, and I raised two follow-up questions. First, the proposal. Natural selection can be considered to parallel artificial selection. Question 1, how appropriate is the parallel? Question 2, is artificial selection artificial? Well, I think the parallel is very close indeed. In each case, consequences shape organisms' form and behavior. In neither case, need this shaping process involve foresight or design. Ha-ha, intelligent designers need not apply. Also, is artificial selection artificial? No. It's completely natural. It's rooted in the law of effect. It itself is a mechanical process, blind mechanical process that strengthens successful behaviors and weakens unsuccessful ones. What has yet to be determined is how unconscious selection, Darwin named it, evolves into methodical selection. Darwin also named that. I really like those terms. I mean, I especially like methodical selection rather than artificial selection, because we've just said artificial selection isn't artificial. Maybe I'm doing that. So, there are, just as a synopsis here, 3 forms of Darwinian selection for you to remember today. Natural selection, sexual selection, and artificial selection. The origins of all 3 may be the result of fixed biological laws that are blind, unconscious, automatic, and do not involve foresight or design. Thank you very much. There's a lot of time for questions, but what I wanted to do before that is just to describe what you're looking at. I know it's hard to see, but what's shown here are these bands represent all the pages of all the editions of The Origin of Species. And what's happening here is this is the first edition, and then successive editions go through the different chapters. Chapter names are up here. Here's a whole new chapter. The point of this is that Darwin's own writing was completely controlled by its consequences. It changed in response to criticisms, new observations, new data, and the like. It's an evolving document. It was for Darwin, and it's been evolving for us ever since Darwin. Is it foresightful? Is it planned? Is it purposeful? I think that this is testimony to that not being the case. But that's just one other illustration. Yes?
We have about 12 minutes for questions, so I'll just run the mic out. You briefly mentioned at the end methodical selection. Can you go into a little more of what that would be?
So methodical selection would be, now, suppose somebody wanted to breed animals. They would go to a book. They would read about this. They would study this. They would learn the techniques, how you create new hybrids, for example, if you were doing corn. All right. It's a codification. It's a method. It's like a recipe. It's like a cookbook. Okay? So, for instance, I didn't really know how to make cosmopolitans. Okay? And I got on the internet and I saw a lot of stuff about what the main ingredients were. And I tried one of them and I didn't like the way it tasted. So what did I do? I varied the combinations until I could finally get the taste that I wanted. So I engaged in a series of variations, and as I came closer to the taste that I was seeking, or at least something that was palatable, I didn't like what I was getting otherwise. Now I've written it down. Now what was once a trial and error process is my recipe. I'll send it to you if you want. But the point is, the point of this is that it's gone from an errorful, random trial and error thing into something now routine. And this happens all the time. I can tell you my little story of the cosmopolitan, but we can't tell you the story of Holstein cows, right? We can't tell you that. People will say, but people design, they plan, it's purposeful, it's foresightful. Well, maybe now, but how did it come to be? It's like the eyeball. It's like all the things that people point to, like the mousetrap. It's like, you know, the cilia on the, right? I mean, it's like all those things, but unless you know how it came about, you don't have any story at all. You can invent anything you want.
So does methodical suggestion or selection, excuse me, entail foresight, and does it entail foresight, or is it still a random process?
It's a tough one for me to answer. It's hard because we're dealing with the end point rather than the process. I'd feel more comfortable answering it if we went back. But can we just accept that it's a codification? It's a rule. We learn rules. We learn rules all the time. Mathematics is a codification. How did mathematics evolve? How did we come to have mathematics? You know, why is it that we use the kinds of algebra that we do use? Do you think that there weren't variations before that were less successful? I mean, we're now stuck with something, and you say, well, I plan to build a bridge, and so I'm going to use this, that, and the other thing. But of course, you're borrowing all kinds of tricks and tools that others have invented along the way. You look at the watch, right? I mean, Dawkins drives me crazy. You know, I mean, the watchmaker designs the watch with foresight and purpose, blah, 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 blah. Well, no person could invent a watch now if they didn't know how you would build a watch. I give as an example, you go to the airport, you have Waterloo Airport, you get in a plane, right? Do you think any single person could build the plane? That they would know all the intricacies of the hydraulic system, the electronic system, the structure of the plane, all the details of it? Do you think anybody could build one? I don't think anybody really knows how one single thing, like an airplane, works. Maybe they do, but I doubt it. You know, if you go to Boeing, there are people that are working on components of the plane. But does anybody know how the whole thing works? Really? You know? Design a plane? Ask Dawkins. He said, here's a drafting board. Go for it. You know, I don't think it's that simple.
I will stand up. I want to make sure I understand you correctly in your cosmopolitan example. It seems you're transitioning from unconscious selection to methodical selection as you go on. There's not a clear
I think that would be, so methodical is the word we would have otherwise used. It would have been artificial. What you're saying is, I think, a proper interpretation. That is what I'm saying. Although I am personally uncomfortable with calling it conscious and purposeful. But that's me, okay? I would like to say that some tastes are more reinforcing than others. The closer I come to the tastes that are reinforcing, I engage in those behaviors that bring me more in closer contact with that. And if you can call it anything you like. I can call it shaping. You can call it, you know, purposeful.
Did I use the word purposeful?
No, but others would.
Okay.
You know, one of my favorite TV celebrities said, "Stop putting words in my mouth. It's bad form and it's unsanitary." So I'm trying not to do that.
Thank you.
Yes, question.
So we're into the age of genetically modified organisms and a whole field of science that I'm not going to pretend to understand in any depth. But what is that do you think is going to do for our understanding of what you've been talking about?
Well, how I perceive this, if we're talking about evolution, is this is yet a further refinement and further development of what breeding practices were all about. And it's a marvelous development. I mean, the triumph of science in terms of understanding the mechanics, the details of organisms in the world around us is just amazing. But I don't think there's any new process that's come online. I think it's all the same. It's, if you want to call it a quest for understanding the world, if you want to say that humans are endowed with this urgency or thirst, fine. But the triumph of science over mysticism, the understanding of how things really work and how they've come to be is, if you want a feeling of awe and wonder and excitement, I suggest looking there.
I have trouble finding awe in like these stories of supposed suicide genes being put into foods like from Monsanto. Can you describe that, explain that?
I haven't, I'm clueless what you're talking about. Maybe someone else can try, but I don't know.
Well, look it up online. It's fascinating.
Okay.
It's so they can't produce their own seed. You have to keep buying them from Monsanto. Every year.
Well, you know, but they say it's not nice to fool Mother Nature.
Some of that's kind of a miss thing. I grew up on a farm and we had hybrid seed corn. We bought seed corn every year, and my mother told about when they first started planting hybrid seed corn. They weren't sure if it was worth. Before that, they saved their seed. They did it because they could make a buck. And the hybrid seeds have done this for a long time. I have a problem. What Monsanto was doing that was really messing the farmers up was that if the pollen blew over in the other field, they were saying you stole it. And they were having problems in the courts with that.
So this is how they maintain control over the...
Right.
Any other questions?
Well, it seems to me that there was a slight incongruency in your talk, but I'd like to know your definition, like your, excuse the term, but your operational definition, per se, of artificial selection.
It's not mine, it's Darwin's. It's simply the human intervention to change the makeup of organisms. It's through selective breeding to change the characteristics of the population of organisms in question.
Then what's, like, if that's your the definition that you're accepting,
yeah.
What is your, how do you ground saying that it is not artificial being in another species intervention?
Well, is sexual selection artificial selection?
Not in my definition.
Why not? It's the interposition of another organism changing the form and behavior of another organism. It happens to be a member of the same species, but what's the difference? So my point, I don't think there's an inconsistency. I think that they're members of the same family where there's another organism doing the selecting. Natural selection involves many more forces. It involves things like climate and nutrient and the like. But again, it's all selection. I think it's all of one stripe. I think the brilliance of the Darwinian revolution, right, is that it encompasses all of this. That Darwin was the one who you know, formalized natural selection, who pointed us to sexual selection and artificial selection is no accident. I think those would all come under the same roof. Where we run into the trick is back to the hinge. Okay, and the sense that humans designed the hinge with foresight and purpose. I wonder if we had Darwin here now, whether he would be willing to think more about the origins of human behaviors and how they have come about over time. And I think he would be more than comfortable with including what we call the law of effect or selection by consequences within that.
But also, what I'm saying is that with human intervention, so to say, it's that a human has a population that it is working with, he or she, you don't want to say it. And with sexual selection, it's essentially individuals. And it's not like one having a power, so to say, over a wide range and picking out what it wants. Whereas
Well, I think we can have an interesting conversation if you now think about humans engaging in selection, of sexual selection, and are selecting one another.
No, I'm talking about.
I mean, that's where
humans
that's where eugenics comes in. I mean, there are all kinds of places where Darwinian thinking has come into play. Okay. I don't know that we're on the same page on that.
I don't think we are.
No. So
Well, thank you.
let me simply say that artificial is just a word. I like the word methodical because I don't think that it involves a fake distinction. Artificial, natural, I think is false dichotomy.
Other questions? Okay, well, let's give a big hand to Dr. Wasserman for a great presentation.